Are you overwhelmed by how much is unraveling in the world? Do you tend to care too much, feel too much, and get easily activated by the news? Does the state of the world make you toggle between deep empathy and total numbness? If so, you're not alone. There's a ton of shit happening in the world right now that's been happening in the world for a while. And if we aren't maintaining personal and spiritual boundaries and practicing self-care instead of self-abandonment, it's easy to get drained by the state of the world. And so in today's episode, we are going to talk about the emotional and spiritual exhaustion, the soul level fatigue from living in a world that feels like it is constantly in crisis, where stressful and tragic events are like literally the daily norm, where war and political polarization and economic instability and climate disruption and cultural fragmentation are not just single traumatic events, but just a constant barrage of destabilizing information that happens faster than most people can mentally and emotionally metabolize. I witnessed so many people in my life becoming exhausted from empathy and concern and rage, and yet they still continue to deplete their nervous systems by not taking a break from the madness that is the world at large right now. And for those of us who feel deeply, who care about justice and healing and liberation and truth, it can be challenging to stay open-hearted and grounded amidst the daily dumpster fire. And so this episode is going to help you learn how to remain informed and how to not bypass your concern while also not drowning in it. So today, we're going to answer these questions. How do we hold compassion without collapsing? How do we stay sovereign without avoiding? How do we keep our hearts optimistic in a world that feels really fucking bleak? And how do we contribute while maintaining clarity and peace and purpose? Welcome to The Simple Source, a paradigm-shifting space where self-love, healing, spirituality, and personal growth are redefined. If you've been told healing takes years, that abundance must be attracted, or that transformation requires struggle, you haven't been told the truth. I'm Linda Valines, a certified trauma-informed holistic coach, author, and spiritual guide. After healing myself from chronic conditions, complex trauma, and lack, not by following traditional frameworks, but by creating my own, I'm now teaching you to love, heal, and free yourself, mind, body, and soul, so you can reclaim your highest health, happiness, and potential with joy and ease. Each week, we go beyond surface-level self-help and into the real mechanics of transformation. If the traditional paths to healing and spirituality haven't produced the changes you want in the life you desire, you're in the right place. You were never meant to struggle or wait for what is already yours. Let's get started with today's episode. So let's start by defining consciousness fatigue, which is not burnout. It's not depletion that comes from personal healing. It's the unique emotional and spiritual exhaustion that arises when you are deeply attuned to the suffering of the world, but you haven't learned how to regulate that awareness and relate to the world's suffering without collapsing. So consciousness fatigue is what happens after unregulated, consistent exposure to collective trauma, crisis, and injustice without maintaining spiritual boundaries, without practicing nervous system recovery or prioritizing self-care and self-love first. It's the fatigue of being deeply empathetic and morally awake in a world that is unraveling and collapsing and feeling the need to be informed while essentially lacking proper regulation. It's the progressive erosion of joy, of clarity, and coherence when your nervous system is exposed to tragedy after tragedy after tragedy without adequate time and boundaries and space to metabolize every tragedy and the cumulative stress in a healthy way. And consciousness fatigue is not the same thing as healing fatigue, which comes from over-identifying with self-improvement or making inner work your full-time identity. And I talked about this in a previous episode recently. And it's not just poor energetic hygiene or general lack of boundaries, right? Even though those are factors. Consciousness fatigue is what happens when the part of you that cares, that empathizes, and that wants to be part of positive change is compromised by unrelenting, unregulated exposure to suffering that you cannot personally resolve. And so the fatigue happens because we cannot hold every injustice in our emotional bodies. We cannot overextend our nervous systems to be an advocate or voice for every cause and every injustice. And unconsciously trying to do so means that you're relating to collective trauma from your personal trauma. It's your trauma that's been engaged and is running the show when you constantly consume and post and donate and spiral and numb and rage and cry without pause to differentiate between your suffering and another's suffering. And it's that unhealed version of you that says that if we care deeply enough, that if you care deeply enough, that you also have to suffer alongside those who suffer. And that's codependency, friend. That's enmeshment. That's a lack of emotional boundaries, because suffering because another person suffers is not actually a meaningful contribution. It's empathy without boundaries. And that will always result in erosion of your own identity and reality and well-being. And so trying to feel for every tragedy and collective trauma is literally unsustainable, not just personally, but also collectively, because people who collapse under the weight of the world, you don't have the energy or the clarity to rebuild and actually consciously choose and participate in a better one. And so there is a way to be informed, to care, to engage without depletion, to avoid personal erasure, and to show up for the world without projecting your own guilt and shame. Now I'm going to list common symptoms of consciousness fatigue and that internalized collective trauma so that you can understand what you're feeling and experiencing and differentiate between what is consciousness fatigue and what's burnout. Consciousness fatigue often looks like overfunctioning. It looks like overcaring, over-consuming. And because it stems from a place of compassion, it can be difficult to recognize it as a form of self-erasure, because it is. And so here are some of the most common mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual symptoms of consciousness fatigue. Mental symptoms are chronic guilt for resting or enjoying life, especially when other people are suffering. Feeling mental overload from trying to track every crisis and injustice at the same time. Obsessive thinking about how to quote unquote fix or do more for the world. Constant questioning of whether you're doing enough, being enough, or standing on the right side of an issue. Also decision paralysis, when your awareness of injustice leads to a fear of making the wrong ethical choice, like what stores to purchase from, how to support, what to say, or if you should be sharing or not sharing on social media. And emotional symptoms are feeling emotional whiplash from consuming trauma content. And then you're looping through rage and grief and helplessness and feeling numb. There's unprocessed grief and helplessness that feels like close to you, but also distant because it's not actually rooted in your personal life. Disassociation or numbness as a protective mechanism from emotional overstimulation, that's a symptom. Performative empathy that feels forced but expected. Also feeling anxious about activism rather than feeling grounded about contributing. And physical and nervous system symptoms are hypervigilance, where anxiety just becomes a baseline and you're just anticipating the next crisis. If you have trouble sleeping and if you feel exhausted despite rest, if you're carrying tension in your jaw, in your chest, or in your gut from carrying emotional burdens that do not belong to you, freezing, like when your body or your brain just sort of goes offline when like another tragedy or devastation enters your field or like you see it on the news, basically. Addiction to intensity. This is a big one. When you just this is doom scrolling. When you just seek out crisis content, even when it's depleting, even when it makes you feel like shit. And spiritual symptoms are over-identification with collective suffering, right? To the point where your personal reality and well-being are just drowned out. Disconnection from joy, being able to detach, feeling disconnected from your own sacredness, and that's all replaced by a sense of spiritual numbness or futility. Giving your energy away to causes and people or systems without replenishment, and confusing pain with purpose, like where you believe suffering is required to be a conscious being, and feeling like your connection to your own divine source has been hijacked by collective trauma. So if any of those, or some of them, or many of them, and many of those symptoms resonate with you, here are some truths to help you recover from consciousness fatigue and reclaim your coherence and sovereignty and clarity again. Firstly, you are not apathetic for protecting your energy. You are not selfish for choosing coherence over chaos. You are not abandoning those who are suffering in the world by choosing to tend to your wholeness first. Because being flooded with collective pain doesn't make you a more spiritual or better person. It makes you a less resourced one. It makes you part of the codependent normalization that perpetuates self-abandonment over self-empowerment. Healing the world does not need another person suffering. It needs more people relinquishing suffering as a means to healing. And so you do not need to exhaust your mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being to contribute in a meaningful way to collective change and awareness. In fact, you cannot, because when you become incoherent and you subvert your spiritual integrity, your sovereignty also becomes distorted. So let's talk about what that means. Okay, so let's define spiritual integrity, coherence, and sovereignty when the world is a daily dumpster fire. So let's go through each, because they're not luxuries, they're actually necessities for keeping yourself sane and for staying well while the world kind of unravels. So spiritual integrity in times of collapse doesn't mean rising above the pain or bypassing the truth by ignoring suffering that's apparent in the world. It means grounding yourself in the knowing that separation is an illusion, but with a healing and not an enmeshed perspective. So that means honoring oneness, right, is not the same thing as absorbing every wound of every tragedy so that you're drowning in every injustice, but you're practicing the fact that when you are embodying your wholeness and you're maintaining your well-being, you naturally project that vibrancy onto others. And that's just as important as compassion. And spiritual integrity in times of collapse means responding from grounded compassion rather than emotional reactivity. It means resisting the urge to become a savior and instead embodying the truth that healing is relational and not heroic. Because spirituality is not performance. It's presence rooted in grounded love, not in codependent enmeshment. And coherence is total and absolute alignment, meaning when your mind, your body, your nervous system, your energy, your soul, your field are not fragmented, distorted, or consistently flooded with unregulated emotional overwhelm, so that you can perceive reality clearly and respond wisely, right, as your highest self. Coherence is when all parts of you are operating in agreement with your highest self, with your highest truth, with your spiritual integrity. It's what allows you to pause before reacting, to speak truth without performance, and to discern what is yours to carry and what is not. And so in the devastation and the chaos of the world as it is now, coherence is actually a form of resistance on its own, right? Against needless suffering and injustice and divisiveness and ignorance. It's actually the stabilizing force that keeps your nervous system from fusing and being fried by all the noise and all the fear and all the contamination. Because you cannot emit genuine and potent healing energy without being coherent. meaning when you're operating from a dysregulated nervous system and compromised field. And spiritual sovereignty is basically ownership, accountability, and responsibility for yourself, rooted in the fact that you always have the freedom of choice to be your true and highest self. It's living in absolute awareness that nothing can prevent you from your own liberated existence. Like nothing is blocking you from being free. Your mind, your body, and your soul. It's knowing that freedom is your birthright. It's knowing that your right to choose is also your birthright. And so nothing can really ever truly inhibit your ability to be your true self. It's knowing when you are being suppressed or being supported. It's knowing that you never need to conform or to compromise yourself for the sake of another. Sovereignty doesn't mean isolation. It just means non-enmeshment, right? You can be deeply empathetic without becoming enmeshed. You can care deeply without collapsing. So sovereignty is what allows you to engage from power, not from codependence, with the collective wounds. It's living the truth that you cannot help the liberation of others when you are enmeshed in their wounds, right? It's living the truth that you can only hold the gate open for others when you are anchored in your own liberation first. So in other words, you cannot support someone else's liberation without knowing your own liberation first. That's sovereignty. So now let's talk about why that is, right? Why spiritual boundaries are necessary for the liberation of global struggle and healing the collective. So spiritual boundaries are not, firstly, they're not separating yourself from the world. They're actually what allow you to meet the complexities and yes, the pain of the world with clarity instead of collapse. They're what keep your nervous system safe from fusing with the collective trauma field and mistaking it as yours to carry. Because when you're enmeshed with the distortion, right, of the collective trauma field that you want to dissolve, like you don't actually elevate it by becoming enmeshed with it, you perpetuate it. Not consciously, but unconsciously through your burnout, through your fear, through your constant outrage without a break, through your performance that you mistake for activism. And so spiritual boundaries are not a betrayal of compassion. They do not require you to be detached and uninformed. They are actually how your compassion is productive and not destructive. They're what allow you to stay present without being consumed, to witness pain without absorbing it, to respond wisely rather than to react impulsively, and to stay in conscious relationship with the collective, not in codependent collapse. So spiritual boundaries, they do protect your coherence. They do protect your presence and your clarity. And that is actually what the world needs more than your exhaustion, more than your suffering. Because true impact isn't made from enmeshment. It's made from grounded love and sacred discernment and the refusal to abandon yourself while trying to save the world or perform activism. So now let's make a distinction between what performative activism is and what purposeful participation is. And in doing that, we have to draw a very clear line, right? Staying informed is not the same thing as being perpetually distressed. Distress is not proof of compassion. It's just proof of dysregulation. You know, we live in a culture where emotional activation is A, normalized, B, mistaken for moral authority, where performative outrage is seen more than actual impact is. But performative activism isn't rooted in truth. It's rooted in unprocessed guilt, unprocessed shame, projection of your personal unresolved traumas, and a nervous system that's just trying to earn its worth through external displays of care and concern. And so, to be clear, performative activism expresses as urgency without clarity, right? When you're reacting quickly, loudly, publicly, without integrating any of that within your own mind, body, soul system. It's moral posturing without embodiment, right? Speaking from pressure to appear righteous, not from your own embodied conviction. It's compulsive sharing with no integration, right? When you post every headline or social justice graphic to signal that you're aware, but it's not actually deepening anyone else's understanding, or it's not facilitating change. It's activism that's driven by fear, basically, of being seen as silent or complicit, right? Meaning you're taking action as a means to protect yourself. It's not real service, and that's more about appearing informed and active than making real impact. And emotional reactivity, right? Disguised as moral high ground, using outrage to assert authority. But in doing so, you're actually avoiding personal responsibility and your own personal regulation. When you shame others for not doing enough, while neglecting your own personal alignment, like when you police other people's actions as a way to pass off your internal guilt or your internal shame and confusion. When you feel disconnected from your personal capacity or your alignment, which shows up as trying to show up everywhere all the time for every cause out of feeling obligated and not true resonance. When you over-identify with causes to avoid your own healing, meaning you use activism as an identity to bypass your own unresolved pain or inner work. Like you're just, like I said earlier, projecting your trauma into the collective trauma. When you confuse volume with value, when you believe that the louder or more visible your stance is, the more it matters. When you sacrifice nervous system health in the name of doing the right thing, that means associating your exhaustion and dysregulation with moral worth. And if you seek external validation for being a quote unquote good person, right, that's you needing to be seen and praised and affirmed for your activism efforts. And if you use rehearsed language without any personal integration, that's like saying the right buzzwords without really truly understanding what they mean or feeling them or living them. And if you have guilt-fueled overcommitment, when you take on roles and initiatives or opinions even that you are not energetically available for, or that are not even really truly aligned with the real you, but you can't say no or you can't say nothing, right, without feeling guilt or shame. Now, on the other hand, purposeful participation is not reactive. It's not rehearsed. It's not rooted in guilt or shame. It is quiet most of the time. It's grounded. It's paced. It's intentional without being performed. And it comes from overflow, not from depletion. It comes from coherence, not chaos. It comes from knowing your role, not performing one. And so purposeful participation sounds like asking yourself these questions, like, where am I most impactful right now? What's actually mine to do in this moment and what is not? How can I serve without abandoning myself? And is this coming from alignment or desperation urgency? Does this action reflect my truth or my fear of being judged? Am I doing this to be seen or because I genuinely feel called? What contribution feels regenerative rather than extractive? If I honored my nervous system, what would change about how I show up right here, right now? And am I acting from guilt or from grounded conviction? Can I trust that my no creates space for someone else's aligned yes? What role do I naturally hold in the collective ecosystem of healing and positive change? And where do I feel emotionally resourced enough to show up fully? If I only had 30 minutes of energy today, what would I give that to? And then ultimately, the most important question to ask yourself is, am I contributing from fear or from coherence? If it's fear, then you've got to pause. You need to regulate. You must root. Because urgency that bypasses your body is not activism. It's trauma reenactment. Again, it's just your trauma, your unresolved trauma being engaged and then projected in collective trauma. And so now that you have an understanding of what's performative and productive, let's just go over, this is the how-to section. Let's go over some practical tips to maintain spiritual boundaries and stay grounded while the world is kind of falling apart. So this is not a list of things that you need to add to your plate, okay? These are practices that are going to help bring you back to yourself, not to numb you out, but to remain whole and resourced. So these are just adjustments that support your coherence, not strain it. So number one is set boundaries with media, right? And do not apologize for it. Do not feel guilty about it. information has become a form of energetic invasion. It's just, there's so much information all the time that you have to be mindful about it. You don't need to constantly be updated all the time to stay informed. Like, you can turn off the notifications from Apple News. And that means also time restricting your news intake, right? You can watch the news like me, where I just mute it and I only read the subtitles. And so also you can mute accounts, social media accounts that reinforce and sell despair and trauma. And you have to take breaks when your body tightens, right? When you are holding your breath, because you're allowed to protect your energy. You're allowed to protect your mind and your body, your field, and you should, because no one else is going to do that for you. And you need to remember that less input is what actually helps you live with more clarity. And number 2 is you always have to regulate before you respond. This takes so much mindfulness and so much presence and intention. That just means before you share, before you donate, before you speak or react, just check in with yourself. Is your body calm? Are you holding your breath? Are you breathing from your belly? Are you centered? If not, pause, come back into coherence, right? Otherwise, you're just transmitting more dysregulation into the collective field, because presence, not panic, is the medicine, right? That's what dissolves distortion. Number 3, you just have to choose 1 or 2 causes that resonate with your soul and then just release the rest. You don't need to take on the responsibility of saving the world. You can channel your care and your concern with coherent energy toward causes that feel aligned. Not obligatory. Those are a lot of C's. But you have to let go of the guilt and the shame for not doing everything. Precision and focus is what creates impact, right? When your energy is scattered, it's diluted energy, and that's what creates burnout and confusion. Number 4, you try to serve with community instead of, being an advocate all on your own. That's going to help your nervous system maintain regulation. So try to be surrounded by people who share your values. If you are truly an activist, find other activists. Surround yourself with people who are aligned with your causes. That's not a luxury, it's a necessity. Being able to talk to people who see the world the way that you do, who are able to grieve with you, who are able to laugh with you and build progress together. Because isolation makes suffering more painful, louder, more prominent. And it's connection that reminds you that suffering is temporary and not a necessity in life. And 5, literally touch the earth often, without agenda. You don't need to be hugging trees every day, but ground yourself in the energy of this planet so that you can root yourself in the biggest cause, which is maintaining the integrity of this giant rock that we all call home. And so that means standing barefoot in the grass, even if it's just 30 seconds a day, letting the sun warm your face, watching the wind move through the trees. The earth is ancient, it's resilient. So build a relationship with her and let her remind you that not everything is in collapse, because nature is coherence in motion. And so when you become attuned to nature, when you build a relationship with nature, when you see yourself through nature, it re-regulates your system. And also, number 6 is you have to consciously reset your nervous system with beauty and laughter. So that means purposefully lightening the mood, purposefully softening your heart. So investing in beauty and laughter as much as you invest in being informed and active is paramount, because it can be easy to get dumpy when the world is a daily dumpster fire. So make looking at art and reading poetry and laughing every day normal. You have to normalize intentional counterbalancing, where you do not negate the tragic, but you balance it with what is actually life-giving. And number 7, lastly, do not abandon joy. Joy, when authentic and not forced, is not spiritual bypassing. It's the most radical act of coherence and healing in a divided and fear-rooted world. So let yourself play, let yourself rest, let yourself love, because that aliveness is real activism. And your joy does not betray the suffering of the world. They can coexist. And when you prioritize joy, it ensures that you remember what your effort and your activism is for. So as the state of the world continues to be volatile and enraging and depressing, I hope that you remember that you are not here to react endlessly to a collapsing world to the point where your own spiritual and personal integrity collapse. You're here to midwife a new one, a better one, a more healed one. So a healthier, more inclusive, healed, peaceful, and harmonious future cannot be built through burnout and outrage without regulation, or just constant projection of your own unresolved trauma into the collective trauma. It must be built through coherence, through clarity, through sovereignty, through joy, through people like you who are willing to choose integrity over urgency, embodiment over performance, and alignment over chaos. So here's your action step for the week. I want you to choose one moment every day this week to choose conscious coherence instead of unconscious consciousness on purpose. You know what I mean? So that might look like placing a hand on your heart and taking a few deep breaths before turning on the news, before scrolling the news, before opening Apple News or what have you. That means checking in with your nervous system and making sure that you are not holding your breath before you share something on a charged topic or you speak about it in a conversation. It could look like asking yourself, is this mine to carry, right? Is this my burden? Is this mine? Before saying yes to a cause or contributing. So those daily moments of just checking in with yourself and your own level of coherence and your own sovereignty and your own clarity, those acts of conscious coherence are not going to disconnect you from the world. What they will do is they will root you in clarity before you show up for the world. And so let that one daily moment of conscious coherence become your activism anchor, because the more that you live in coherence, the more that your consciousness is clear for true purpose, and it becomes less contaminated with you projecting your own trauma into the collective trauma. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope this episode awakened you, inspired you, and reminded you of what's possible when you love, heal, and free yourself and reclaim your highest truth and power. If this show has transformed or enlightened your self-love, growth, and healing journey, please like, save, and share this episode and leave a positive review on Apple or Spotify. And subscribe to be reminded of new episodes. Your support is deeply appreciated and truly helps this show so much. And if today's episode resonated with you, don't stop here. Go deeper. My book, Unconditional, You Are Perfect As You Are, expands on these teachings and gives you the missing framework about self-love that no one is talking about. So get your copy today to start reading and loving yourself more. And if you're ready for the ultimate healing journey with daily instruction and guidance from me, I'd love to see you inside the Source membership, the only holistic and comprehensive step-by-step self-healing program that is proven to work. Remember, you were never meant to struggle or wait for what is already yours. It's time to claim everything you want and more. All the links are in the show notes. I'll see you next time.